Well, good evening, and nice to see you again if you've been at the earlier events, and welcome if you're only coming for the first time. You're showing great stamina to go from 10:30 to 7:30 in the evening. But it is wonderful to have live events again, I hope you'll agree. This festival is brought to you, I feel like I'm on television, but anyway, brought to you by Dublin City Council, by the City Libraries, in partnership with the City Council Culture Company. You can take your masks off if you wish, but if you want to keep them on, that's up to yourselves. This last event is about the Phoenix Park murders. Julie Kavanagh, the author, is a distinguished journalist, former New Yorker, London editor, former arts editor at Harper & Queen, and a Costa Biography Award final professor of Irish history at Hertford College, Oxford, from 1991 until 2016. You will get a chance to ask some questions afterwards, but we can't pass around a microphone due to COVID restrictions. So I will signal, ask you to put your hand up and signal to go to one of the nearest microphones. There's one on that side, one on that side, and one on that side. I feel like an air hostess now. Anyway, listen, can you please welcome Julie Kavanagh and Roy Foster?
Good evening. There's a fashion nowadays for writing the history of a year, either in someone's life or in a historical process. Some of us tend to think more in decades. And I think one of the key pivotal decades of Irish history is the 1880s, beginning with the Land War and ending with the fall of Parnell. So many chances appeared and disappeared, so many events came up and destabilized expectations. The book we're going to talk about this evening deals with an event in the 1880s, but it also spools out to take in the echoes and the ramifications of that event. It was an event of great horror and immediacy, the slashing to death with surgical knives of the Undersecretary and Chief Secretary of Ireland, two the most senior castle officials, in Phoenix Park by the Polo Ground on the 6th of May, 1881. Julie Kavanagh has written this absorbing and I think marvelous book about it. And I want to discuss at the beginning how she came to write it. Julie is a very established critic and authority on the history of ballet, and has written marvelous books on Frederick Ashton and Rudolf Nureyev. This is a very different world, but it's one that she inhabits. It's a considerable achievement, this book. It's quarried from archives, from local history, from murky police records, from newspapers, and she interlinks this world, these various worlds that were affected by this event. Though deeply researched, it's compulsively readable, and it brings to life the tangled and violent tale with freshness and insight. She has a gift for bringing people and events to life. And I think I'd like to begin by asking her to read a paragraph that I think illustrates that. Julie.
On a drizzly day in Dublin at the end of December 1880, a young Englishwoman looking out of her carriage window found herself chilled by the sullen expressions of men on the streets. It was a public holiday, and the increased numbers lurking on corners and along the River Liffey quays only added to the palpable sense of an impending threat. I realized with painful vividness the truth that given a crowd of Irish in any town in Ireland, it would be easy, by a single inflammatory appeal from a professed patriot, to excite every man, woman, and child present into a patriotic frenzy against England, against ourselves. Florence Foster was the daughter of William Foster, the British minister responsible for governing Ireland and a despised symbol of centuries-old oppression. He had just introduced a coercion bill in Parliament calling for draconian powers to subjugate violent Irish extremists, and his daughter's unease about simmering vengeance was a premonition. It would not be long before the glowering men in the streets were actual assassins, a gang of mercenaries calling themselves the Invincibles. As the Forsters' carriage sped along the esplanade, past the Guinness Brewery and towards Victoria Bridge, they planned to kill the horses and shoot the Chief Secretary, even though a lady, almost certainly Florence, was sitting by his side. A transatlantic murder conspiracy had been hatched, its object to remove British figures of authority regarded by the perpetrators as tyrants. Mr. Forster was the first name.
Thank you. Well, there's a number of themes there we'll pick up later on. Notably, the word transatlantic is important here, and the depth of antipathy and ruthlessness and historical hatred which that passage evokes. But Julie, I'd like first to get to the beginnings of the book and how you, from coming from ostensibly a very different background, a very different range of expertise as a writer, how you decided to take up and put so much time, effort, and work into this story.
Well, I was about 11 or 12, and we were living in Cape Town in South Africa, and I remember my father, who was a journalist for a national newspaper there, the Cape Argus, talking about the Phoenix Park murders, and it was just a vague memory. And not until 25 years later did I find a notebook in a trunk where he had written in italic hand very, very detailed account of a trial that took place on the high seas in 1883. And I started reading it and became absolutely fascinated. I remember sitting down by the trunk and carrying on reading. And
Your father having died?
My father, yes. My father died in 1966. And so he had to abandon this project. And in the trunk were papers where he was describing his synopsis he wrote to his publisher. And so I just became intrigued, really, and hooked on the idea and began reading about the Phoenix Park murders themselves and the murder that happened on board ship on the high seas. And that was the beginning. And then I realized this was a much bigger story than the murder yarn that I'd got excited about, I suppose, at the beginning. And the context, the political and historical context became part of the story itself. It was quite nerve-wracking because, as you say, I mean, my background is I mean, I've written a biography of a choreographer and a dancer and a muse for the Traviata, so this was not my territory in any way. But I mean, any biography has to be in context, and my Nureyev biography, I'd had to sort of tackle Stalin's mass colonization, and so I thought, well, this is something I have to educate myself on.
But your father's interest came from his own Irishness, or was he part of a very lively Irish community in South Africa?
Well, my father's interest was mostly because his grandparents had had a store in Harrington Road, which was up the road from Rowland Street Prison, which is where the assassin I call him, Patrick O'Donnell, had been held in Cape Town. And there was such an Irish community in Cape Town that he was this sort of darling of their community, and he became, people couldn't believe that he was actually there down the road, and so the Irish would be bringing whiskey and meals and saying the rosary and praying for him. And my father remembered this, being told this by his grandparents, and so it had this South African extra fascination for him.
Patrick O'Donnell, who was the man who killed Carey the informer, is, of course, the centre. He's the jumping-off point, in a sense, and he's the relatively obscure figure whom your book circles back to and back to. But I want to talk a little about the way you constructed the book, because to me it's almost cinematic. The book scrolls in and focuses on certain individuals, and then the camera tracks back and pans out to the larger context. It's a subtle and careful construction, which I imagine took a lot of thought and a lot of rewriting. And it moves from Gweedore, County Donegal, to Windsor Castle, to Dublin, to America, finally back to South Africa. And it also explores this, the way you've written it, I think, enables you to explore the links between agrarian violence and Fenian radicalism in a way that opens up avenues that we haven't explored before. Did you put a lot of thought into the way you were going to do that?
It seemed to be sort of fairly organic and happen fairly naturally. I mean, what I was trying to do was get inside the minds of each of the characters and the cast, and by doing that, I would go from a cabin in Gweedore to Windsor Castle, which is, you know, or where, because Queen Victoria is an important character in the book. And I think one of my main worries was that it would read in a very sort of bitty way, and I wanted it to flow almost like like a sort of television drama series, like The Wire or something. They cut from one scene to another, or The Sopranos cut. And I thought if it works on screen, there's no reason why it shouldn't work in a sort of narrative non-fiction way.
It does work for me very strongly, and it also flashes in with little connections where you have Queen Victoria actually reading copies of something that Michael Davitt has written, knowing the names of the people who are involved in the trials of the Phoenix Park murders, constantly asking how it's going on, what's happening. I had no idea that her knowledge and interest was as intimate and as almost prurient.
Yes, it was prurient, definitely. I mean, it was, she was getting, she was insisting on knowing, for example, the exact spot, and she wanted photographs of the exact spot. And I mean, it was almost like a sort of tabloid interest in these murders, and she wanted blow-by-blow accounts. And Courtney Boyle at the castle was instructed to provide these. I mean, I feel very equivocal about her because she was an interfering old bat, really, in terms of what she did with trying to get in the way of Gladstone's re-election. And I mean, I think she was genuinely interested, and she asked for one of the victim, Thomas Burke's sister, that she'd be somehow given some sort of pension, and she wanted some kind of memorial in Phoenix Park, and so she was emotionally very taken. And Lucy Cavendish, the widow, again is an important character in the book, and she was lady in waiting to Queen Victoria, and so. I mean, I think Lucy Cavendish was very, she was very fond of Queen Victoria for all her faults.
We'll come back to those individual characters, especially the women, who I think are marvelously drawn. But just sticking with your construction, the way you track the movements of the people you're dealing with, I was reminded, you talked about the cinematic cut. I was reminded of the way that Trollope describes Ferdinand Lopez's suicide in his novel The Prime Minister. Do you know that novel?
No, I don't.
Well, it describes in merciless detail what he sees as he walks to the railway station, where we suspect he's going to throw himself under a train. It describes how the time ticks by on the station clock and on his watch, how the train is coming towards him. Yeah. But I was reminded of that when I read your description of Lord Frederick Cavendish, this gilded Whig youth, son of the Duke of Devonshire, first day on the job in Dublin Castle as Chief Secretary. Certain amount of nepotism about his appointment, as people said at the time, because he's a great favourite of Gladstone's. He's married to Gladstone's favourite niece. But he's a decent, if not, I think, stellar person. And Julie describes him, first day in Dublin Castle, meeting Thomas Burke, going through all the stuff he has to do, and then walking from the castle along the quays, isn't it? And then out through the main entrance to Phoenix Park, yes. Walking, as we know, to his death, and you describe it so carefully. I wondered as I read it, did you footstep that yourself? Did you do
I
that?
didn't actually physically footstep it, but I mean, my inspiration obviously was Ulysses. You know, just that thing
Yes.
of walking past specific places, and I think I went to Thompson's directory to find out, you know, what shops he would have walked past, and what you know, the gunsmith and what pubs. And then I was so blessed to have a source that it was a letter that Lord Spencer wrote to Lucy, because she was hungry for incredible detail as a way of just exorcising her grief. And so he wrote the most wonderful letter about the journey he took with Cavendish from London, the crossing they made, literally the last minutes of his last 2 days. And that was a long letter that I found at Chatsworth in the archives.
Those letters of Lord Spencer's that you describe the handwriting trailing and blurred, and he may even have been weeping. As
Yes, I think there was a splodge of a tear actually on the...
Terribly vivid the way you do that. Since you've mentioned Joyce, I think we have to deviate slightly into what the Phoenix Park murders meant for James Joyce and Ulysses. Can you talk a little about that? Because many people who don't know anything else about the Phoenix Park murders, if they're literary scholars, will have come across Skin the Goat Harris, and I think we have to hear something about Skin the Goat.
Yes, I mean, Joyce was pretty fixated by the Phoenix Park murders. He loathed James Carey, the informer, and he maligned him unfairly, actually. He said he was in the pay of the castle. But he was riveted by Skin the Goat, Skin the etc., he'd call him, and he keeps cropping up. And there are scenes, obviously, in Ulysses that refer to the not just the murders, but not just the murders, but also in Finnegan's Wake. You know, he's there's
Skin the Goat, by the way, was the cabman who drove the cab, isn't that?
Yes. But my former Don at Oxford said I was faking. He caught me faking with Joyce, so I wouldn't like to talk today about it. You'd be better.
I won't push
Roy.
you further, but when you mentioned Ulysses, I had to turn to that. In this extraordinarily interlinked story that you have uncovered, is there anything that really surprised you that you just did not expect?
I think the degree to which it was such a golden moment, and the way that the murders just decimated this moment of hope. I hadn't realized, certainly when I was looking through the trunk, that there was going to be this vital turning point in Anglo-Irish relations, and just, you know, how just to the degree to that impacted on history. I mean, that was extraordinary. And whether, had it not been for the murders, I mean, would Home Rule have happened? I mean, earlier in the 1880s?
The murders come at the very moment when Gladstone has made what was called a treaty, though everyone insisted it wasn't, with Charles Stewart Parnell, by which Parnell would leave prison and would engage in return for new land legislation to dial down the question of agrarian violence. And it could be seen as the beginning of what was later called the Union of Hearts between the Liberal Party and the Irish Party. But the Phoenix Park murders derailed it for a few years, and I think permanently derailed what could have been a much bigger rapprochement. I think that's what you're saying. There were things that surprised me about the book, not particularly that derailment, which I thought I knew about, but the global aspects of it, the way people cross and recross the Atlantic with such frequency and facility, even people at a very humble level of life with very few resources. You know, it wasn't the Ryanair age, but the way the O'Donnell family live in America and Ireland and back again, that fascinated me. And I thought you drew it very vividly.
Well, I suppose, I mean, Irish America was so vital as well, and you know, so therefore there was the backing of the financial backing for the murders was being completely organised by, it was the Irish World and Patrick Ford. But I mean, I don't know, yes, I mean, Pat O'Donnell was going back and forwards, and which in fact, when I went to Gweedore and to Donegal, that was one of the reasons, the sort of local law, that the fact he was going back and forward so much were reason to believe that perhaps he was somehow being paid by the Clan Gael to...
He was more of a political agent than
yes,
individual operator.
Yes, because I mean, how else would he have afforded to go
Yes.
back and forth to that degree?
Let's get back to the cast of characters. You mentioned the old bat, Queen Victoria, but there's also Gladstone, Parnell, Davitt, and as I said, a range of very strongly influential and politically active women. Not only Lucy Cavendish, but Mary Gladstone, who is effectively her father's hostess and go-to person for all sorts of political connections. Catherine O'Shea and Mary Ann Byrne. Can you talk a little about those various women?
Well, to go to the last one, Mary Ann Byrne was married to Frank Byrne, who was the Land League's secretary in London. But it was Frank Byrne that organised the surgical knives that were the weapons of murder in the park. And it was Mary Ann, his wife, who actually, she was pregnant at the time, and somehow strung them under a cloak and brought them to Dublin and brought them to the house of James Carey. So she was a ballsy lady. And at the end, after the murders, I think it was something like 2 or 3 years later, there was a banquet held in New York, and it was a banquet to celebrate the murders by the ringleaders who'd all fled there. And she was given a very well-filled purse as thank you for, the risk she took.
And how about Catherine O'Shea, a figure who fascinates me and who has received some due for her highly political manoeuvrings as Parnell's conduit to Gladstone?
Yes, I mean, she was the go-between, and I think she was. I mean, this is more your subject, Roy, than mine. But she enabled Parnell to sort of negotiate with Gladstone in a way that would have been very risky for him. But she was his sort of private voice, as you like.
But her role in this and her husband's role also points up just how risky a game Parnell was playing with his private life, where he had a liaison, he had children with the wife of one of his political party. And in order to keep him quiet and acquiescent, Willie O'Shea, a useless person, is involved in the Kilmainham Treaty negotiations and actually screws them up badly by keeping something back in a parliamentary exchange. The risks Parnell took in order to sustain his extraordinarily dangerous private love life, while on the edge of bringing about great resolutions, not only in land, but possibly in political arrangements between Britain and Ireland, you have to just look open-mouthed at the hubris that he was inviting upon himself.
But she seems to have been the huge moderating force for him, doesn't she? I mean, he seemed to have, I mean, if you look at what Henry Le Caron, for example, the spy who was infiltrated the Clan Gael, and when he gave evidence at the Parnell Commission, he was saying the degree to which that Parnell had been. I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Yeah. What were you talking?
Well, I was thinking really of the extraordinary sequence of events when Parnell is released from prison.
Yes.
Goes to Paris to a family funeral. On the way back, visits his mistress to see the child they have had together, which Willie O'Shea, who was also in the house, has to pretend is his child.
Yes.
And the child is dying. And in that extraordinary situation, Parnell and Willie O'Shea are drawing up what will become the treaty between Gladstone and Parnell, treaty as so-called, the arrangement, which will usher in a new, it's thought, era of cooperation between the Liberals and the up to then pariah-like Irish party. And it's just on the eve of this detonating act, the Phoenix Park murders, which will change all that. It's the drama of that which I think makes your book read in an almost, I mean this in the best possible way, in a novelized way from time to time. The larger issues, as I've just tried to indicate, that this story and this shocking event cast light on are enormous. I think Irish or Anglo-Irish relations are illuminated by it, and not in a very encouraging way. It seems to me that the Phoenix Park murders gave carte blanche to the stereotyping of the Irish as certainly incapable of self-government, prone to horrific acts of violence, and ungrateful for everything that the munificent British government wanted to give them. Do you think that's a fair summation?
Probably, yes, indeed. I mean, I think, it definitely, it increased the hostility, I think, that could have been, the Parnell Commission just showed that, to the degree to which there was this underlying hostility.
Well, one way in which the Phoenix Park murders project forward, and I mentioned the whole history of the decade of the 1880s, and one of the key events in them was it turned out to be forged letters which the Times published in 1888, which I think from the very end of 87 they were circulating, which claimed that Parnell had approved of the murders. And I think the people who set up this conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy, could have chosen no more electric issue, even, 7 years after the event, than the Phoenix Park murders. They had that kind of valency and that kind of association that instantly people were going to say, well, typical, that's what we always knew about the Irish.
Yes.
They were always in cahoots with the murderers.
Yes, yes, Queen Victoria makes that connection with saying that the Land League and the assassins and the Fenians were all connected. And so she was almost delighted when the murders proved her right.
You get wonderful gleeful quotes from her. Are they from her diaries or her letters?
Both, yes. I think she's very funny about her labels for Gladstone as wild, crazy fanatic, and you have to sort of smile really, because she seemed to, but she did actually. She at the end she was incredibly unconstitutional in what she was trying to oust him and prevent another attempt at home rule, and she got the help of Joseph Chamberlain, didn't she?
When Salisbury's brief government was going out of power in '86 and Gladstone was coming in, she instructed her departing ministers to agitate in every village against this vile, idiotic idea of Gladstone's, completely breaking every political convention of monarchical impartiality. The other aspect of your book, which, again, I think of novels, I think of Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, I think of Inspector Bucket in Bleak House, John Mallon, the detective inspector who tracks the conspirators, who has an extraordinary, intimate, almost cat-like knowledge of what's going on, or a lot of what's going on, at the level of terrorist conspiracy. Mallon seems to me to almost prefigure the kind of relations between the secret state and the underground and often underhand ways in which it works or thinks it has to work to combat terrorism. And on the other hand, these terrorists, if that's the word to use here, because it is a tactic of terrorism that the Invincibles are advocating, and how they go about their operations.
He was extraordinary to know way ahead what was going on. He just a couple of days after the murders, he'd actually named Carey and the other main people. And actually, on his first report, there's a penciled note in his hand saying P. Egan, Phoenix Park. So he he'd nailed the mastermind right at the beginning. He also predicted this assassination,
Yes.
this whole conspiracy that was going to take place. And actually, I mean, when the Irish Times reviewed my book, there was Frank Callahan, I brought it to, said that actually there's no way that it would have taken place. One can be quite certain, this was a pull quote, that Joseph Biggar, Parnell's plain-spoken ally in obstructionism, did not meet emissaries from America to discuss the formation of a murder society. But actually, in November 1881, Sheridan visited Dublin in disguise with dispatches, and this meeting was held with two Irish MPs, Biggar and Barry, with Egan, who was the mastermind, was there as well. And so there was a meeting where this conspiracy was planned that happened, and that Mallon knew about. So, you know, he had a network of informers, and actually his biographer, Donald McCracken, who I think is watching this 7,000 miles away in Natal, was riveting on this, just to
Yes.
the degree to which he was hanging out in bars and infiltrating the underworld, to the degree where he gained all this information. But although he had these informers, he couldn't in court use the evidence of informant. It had to be corroborated by an untainted witness. And so...
Because also you'd lose the value of your informers if you exposed them. It was shocking to people when Le Caron or Beach turned up at the Parnell Commission and gave evidence.
Yes.
People thought, my God, that's who he is.
Yes.
He's been keeping an eye on us all.
Well, Mallon refused to give evidence. I mean, he was virtually subpoenaed and forced to give evidence. But I think there's a quote in another memoir where he said, I prefer Waterloo Bridge, and he would have, he was not going to reveal his sources. Or he could have given away so much.
Yes.
He could have nailed Patrick Egan. But that's complicated by the fact that he probably owed his life to Patrick Egan, because there was an attempt by the Invincibles were going to assassinate Mallon because he knew too much, and Egan actually saved his life. He called them off.
Informers are, in a sense, part of the theme of your book, and informer, as I'm sure most people in this room know, is one of the worst names you can apply to anyone in Irish life. Liam O'Flaherty's novel, The Informer, illustrates it at a later stage. Informers, there's a curious kind of theology that they apply to themselves. Carey always said he wasn't an informer because he hadn't sent anyone to prison. Was that right?
That's right, yes.
Which I can't really follow, though his wife defended it after he was killed himself for having become that most hated thing, an informer. And part of the reason why Patrick O'Donnell is a hero to this day in several places is because he dispatched somebody who had done the unspeakable and had informed. Why did Carey claim that he wasn't really an informer?
Well, first of all, he actually wrote to Joe Brady, who was one of the two actual murderers. He wrote to Joe Brady's parents to say that, and he names all the Invincibles who actually informed before he had. And then after he'd informed, more people didn't. It was only Joe Brady. Skin the Goat was informed. Yeah. Tim Kelly, the young boy who was the other actual murderer, he tried to save his neck by giving information. So actually, I think Carey was rather a scapegoat.
So if you turn Queen's evidence in court, that's not the same as being an informer. That's Carey's argument.
No, I think he was saying that he hadn't actually sent anyone to their deaths because they were mostly using Carey to get at the ringleaders. Yes. They knew that he would lead them to the key masterminds of it all.
You've mentioned a name that recurs throughout your book. And one of the valuable things of this book is it shows us just how important Patrick Egan was. He didn't come into the public eye. He isn't seen as a key figure in any of the histories of the 1880s that I've read. Possibly Loan O'Brien's Revolutionary Underground. Books that deal entirely with radical Fenianism do stress his importance. But you show that he had fingers in so many pies, that he was so influential in getting the money, that he really pulled most of the strings and then disappears off to America and becomes, what is it, Minister to Chile?
Minister to Chile, yes. But, I mean, that was quite important. He was actually, he was reporting back to the American president, but he'd always been in the shadows before. I mean, I remember reading that you might know more about this, Roy, that he was almost like a mentor figure to Parnell. And Parnell actually was very forgiving. He did suspect him. He did actually stop the Land League funds. And Davitt suspected him too, and actually went to Paris to question him. No, I think he's the real villain of the book. And he's Henri Le Caron, who's the spy, writes pretty chillingly about him.
Yes.
How he had this very bluff, jovial front, but actually it was a sort of, it was an iron fist behind that velvet glove.
But a very influential iron fist. I remember my old teacher, Theo Moody, once said to me that Davitt was the Trotsky of the Irish Revolution and John Devoy was the Lenin. But I wonder who, in that parallel, I wonder who Egan was.
Well, I think he was straddling both. He believed that the way forward was through the constitutional way, so he believed in that. But he also had his activist, illegal. I think he was straddling two camps there.
I think you could do that more convincingly, or convince yourself that it was more viable and valid and to be like that if you were based in America or in Paris, and Paris is somewhere that figures large in your story. That's where so many of these people are based, and that's where so much money is squirreled away as well, which later Parnell would be accused of misusing the Paris funds. It's an aspect of the sort of global reach of your story.
Well, I think his relationship with Patrick Ford was unbelievably powerful, but also quite pretty dangerous, really. I mean, the Clan and Gael were worried about it and tried to siphon off some of the funds back into the Irish independence and that policy. I mean, it was, but they were both. I mean, there was an enormous amount of money.
An enormous amount. We're dealing with
millions
in our terms.
Yes.
Which makes, just to shift the focus a little, Parnell's action in cutting off funds to the Ladies' Land League, giving them £500 to wind up everything, one of the least admirable acts of his slightly checkered career, I think.
Yes.
Well, we've talked for, nearly 45 minutes, and I think it's time that we opened it for questions from the floor. Bert, is that? Where are you? I think there's a fixed microphone, is that right, that you can...
There is, yeah. Any questions? You've been stunned into silence by the brilliance of the talk. There might be some online questions coming, so you can carry on for a bit if you have more to say.
How do the online questions come through?
They'll be coming through any second.
Well, is there anything you'd like to add to how you've put across this extraordinarily tangled, I was going to say, but tangled isn't a fair word, complex and thrilling story?
Well, just, I suppose it just incredibly rewarding the way it grew and got more and more important. And you know, I thought at the beginning I was just going to write about the sort of murders, and then it just snowballed and avalanched into something that was really, really a big story. So.
Were you surprised to find when you went into Donegal local sources, and I know you were helped much by local historians,
yes,
that there was such a lively historic memory of Patrick O'Donnell and his family and what?
Yes, I mean, I
in-
think I found it very hard to, because there are two camps that O'Donnell was sent and was an avenger, and that he was actually just, it was pure coincidence that he was on the ship when Carey was there. So that was quite hard for me to think, you know, what was right. And there's local law that, you know.
Yeah, in the end, I felt reading you, though you were very balanced about this, that you believed that, was it A.M. Sullivan who wrote the long, you think
Exactly.
it was he who wrote a long account that really...
That's what swayed me,
Yeah.
indeed. That was, it was called a posthumous confession, and it was in, I think it was United Ireland, and it was the whole narrative again, but just completely countering the idea that O'Donnell had killed in self-defense, and that actually it was cold-blooded murder. But it was...
And that he was an emissary of the...
No, that he wasn't. He wasn't
Yeah.
an emissary. I mean, that
But it was, so to speak, an ideological act.
well, no, I think he was so appalled. We spoke earlier about he was so appalled that he'd made a friend of the most despised informer, you know, that he'd actually been chumming up with him, as he put it. That he spent a sleepless night thinking, is this man really? Because he had a different name, Power, and could this really be James Carey? And then he says in this posthumous confession that he decided to test him, and then when he knew, he killed him.
And drink may have been involved. He was
And I
someone
think
with
that's
a
my
slight-
theory, because he couldn't drink. I think he probably was an alcoholic, I mean, from some evidence. And he was drinking that day. And it was a ship's saloon bar. And he was drinking in order to draw Carey out.
It's another of those scenes that might come from a novel, the way you build up the tension of that. It's fascinatingly done. Bert, do we have an online question coming in?
Sorry, just a quick question. It just occurred to me, just listening to you, does this have any effect with other avenues of independence in other countries? I'm thinking in particular of India, where that massacre in the 1920s culminated in an assassin getting the general who... There was an assassin who assassinated the general who committed that massacre in India, I think in the 1970s. I'm not too sure about the year. I was wondering, was that an inspiration for other forms of assassinations within the British Empire and other countries, particularly India or South Africa or somewhere else like that?
What do you think, Roy?
Was the assassination, you mean the assassination of
It's the killings
Cavendish
in-
and
yeah.
Burke, or the killing of Carey?
I'm thinking particularly, was it kind of an inspiration to other forms of rebellion, particular of India? Years later when...
I think both Indian nationalists and Egyptian nationalists in the very late 19th and very early 20th century looked closely at what had been happening in Ireland. And of course, after 1921, all the more so. The Indian assassination you're thinking of, is this Dhingra?
Yeah, the general who committed who ordered the massacre of the...
Oh, you mean Amritsar?
Yes.
It's not my
Sorry,
expertise, I'm afraid. I think that, on the other hand, you could also say, of course, that political assassination is as old as time, and you didn't need the Phoenix Park murders to
In one part of the British Empire, did inspire others in other countries that were under British rule to kind of galvanise, I think along the same lines, possibly.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I just have two questions that maybe are quite simple or basic as well. But first of all, you talked about kind of the elite reaction, but do you know what the reaction was among the general Irish population to the assassinations? And secondly, this again is probably a very basic question, but why did they use knives? It seems like a very brutal decision and way of doing it, as distinct from maybe guns or explosives. So just those 2 points: the reaction, if we have it, of the general Irish population, and secondly, why did they choose that particular method? Do you know?
Well, the reaction of I think, even very strong nationalists were pretty appalled because Frederick Cavendish was a messenger of peace. So I think that was very shocking for people. And in terms of the method of killing them, I mean, the knives make no sound. So that was the pure reason, I'm pretty sure, and the cover of my American edition has an actual surgical knife, and that they were beautifully honed, and they were deadly.
Yes, I wouldn't accuse you of Queen Victoria-like prurience, but you do describe the knives with an almost chilling level of detail. As to the reaction of the populace at large, I think it was, as Julie says, generally appalled if you were, let's say, a moderate or even quite an advanced nationalist, because what was really striking people was that Forster, the deeply unpopular Chief Secretary, who was rather unfairly called Buckshot Forster and was blamed for a whole raft of coercive measures, he had resigned and was replaced by this unsullied, idealistic young Whig, closely related to Gladstone, who was seen as, exactly as Julie says, as a messenger of peace. And so it was a sense of having broken a sort of hopeful progression by killing him. Little like the Ewart Biggs murder, to kill an ambassador, in a sense. And he was seen as an ambassador from Gladstone, with bringing the promise of a new kind of entente cordiale. And this shocked many people, even people who had no great sympathy for British government in Ireland.
Yes, I mean, the killing of Carey, on the other hand, that caused massive celebration.
Both Davitt and Parnell, and I learned this from your book, said very specifically and in public, the killing of Carey was not murder. No murder was committed by Patrick O'Donnell. They were effectively or implicitly saying this was simply an execution, and a deserved execution. I was very struck by that. Davitt, as an old Fenian with a police record, you might expect. Parnell, I hadn't realised he'd said that in public. Quite.
Yes, he said he was as innocent as the babe
exactly,
born or
yes.
something. Yeah.
Which makes one think again of Parnell having rather closer links and sympathies to Fenianism than used to be generally allowed. And you look at that a little as well in your book. Bert, is there another question?
This is a question from our online audience. Did the Invincibles have connections with either the Clan na Gael or any other IRB or Fenian splinter group?
Well, the British authorities consulted Henri Le Caron, and he wrote a long report saying that actually no, I mean there was no evidence that the clan were involved in any way. I mean it's in the notes. The full report is in the notes in my book.
The clan weren't officially involved, but the clan themselves had radical splinter elements, and later there would be a big split in the 1890s. But yes, the public record is exactly as you say. Was there another question coming in online?
One more question from Sandy. Is the actual spot of the assassination marked?
There's a pebble cross, I'm told, and I'm going to go and see it myself this week. But nothing else, no.
So, one more question before we run. Yeah.
No, just to come back to the question about was there an alternative view to the received view of the middle classes in Ireland and the British authorities as such. Looking at the denunciation of Carey and his unpopularity, I would accept that it's very hard to actually explore the alternative view, given that at the time in Ireland, a lot of the peasantry outside of Dublin would have been illiterate in English anyway. And I think that would be worth exploring, but I also think it would be very difficult to research. Just a comment as well, but it's maybe a question in its own way. Words like horrific are quite loaded and they can be quite relative, even in history, in that a class that may have found, and the British authorities themselves have found, the murder of 3 people, albeit in a very barbaric way, to be horrific. It's less than 30 years since the famine, where 1 million Irish people died of starvation, where people were found in cabins having eaten human flesh. Another 2 million people were forced to emigrate. And the insensitivity that was shown at that time, at best insensitive, of the British authorities to the suffering in Ireland, you have to question words like horrific even, how relative they are and how they're used, and that they only represent a certain view, even in Ireland at the time.
I think that's a very important point about the memory of the famine, and I would say Julie's book, to me, one of the strongest parts in it was the description of the conditions people still lived in Donegal in the 1880s, 40 years after the famine, and the horrified descriptions by, was it James Hack-Tuke, Quaker visitor, trying to publicise that people were living literally in holes in the ground and barefoot in these shocking conditions. And I think that does, of course, inflect the way that a murder of representatives of a British government in Ireland were seen. That said, I think that slashing people's throats with surgical knives in a frenzy of fury is a fairly horrific act. And I think if it was I who used the word horrific, I'm probably going to stand by that. But I do take your point. That also an important point you made, which is that to excavate or to assess popular opinion, especially in a country which is as divided in terms of linguistic and literate ability as Ireland is at this time, is well nigh impossible. You have to rely on folk memory, you have to rely on newspapers which are fascinating but often misleading records. One of the strengths of Julie's book to me was the balance and the impartiality with which she assessed different kinds of evidence and the sympathy with which she looked, and that's why Donegal is so important in your book, at the conditions of life that pushed people to extremes of violence. And sometimes violence is an extreme that people are pushed to, and that was true in some ways in this period. I still would say, as we began by saying, that the 1880s were a period when much went awry or differently than it could have, that it's an era of radical initiatives, missed chances, the beginnings of what to me is the most important revolution in Irish history, which is the revolution in land ownership, which inflected and conditioned so much about the political revolution that would follow 30-odd years later. I think that the 1880s are a key period, and for me one of the values of this book is that it brings together in a whole network of connections, influences, counter-influences, obscurities, mistakes, the ongoing drama and often tragedy of the government of Ireland, and helps explain how it ended as it did. British government of Ireland, I mean, of course.
On which note, it's probably time to thank Julie Roy for an excellent talk. It's been a fascinating day, 4 great events, and it will not have escaped you that the threads of Irish history from 1880 right up into Susan McKay talking about the present day. It's been fascinating to hear 8 terrific speakers. I hope you'll agree. Now, the book, as you know, we're not doing signing sessions, but Judy has signed books, and they're out in the foyer if you want to get one there. Tomorrow we have 2 events starting at 11 a.m., so a short day, but if you've enjoyed today, do come along tomorrow. So thanks for coming along. Thank you.